So one of the first tasks that we had to do as a MIC interns was to go to the Fairmont Hotel, I believe that was the name. And we were going to cover I think it was the Canadian press conference. Um, and it was going to be the first time that I was going to cover a red carpet event. I was going to basically cover a press conference. That was the first time. And so I was very nervous, just because I didn't really know what I was walking myself into. It's like when you go to journalism school, you kind of they walk you through different things. And I also took a photojournalism class, so we had like different stimulated scenarios of like, here's how you cover a press conference. But they were never like real, like you're assigned, you get your pass, you're in a pit, you're shooting. Like it was never that direct. It was sort of all scenario based. And so in my mind, I had all this in the back of my head. But then I was like, okay, I don't really know who I'm shooting. I don't know how they look like. I don't know what the lighting's gonna be in there. So I tried to be as prepared as I could, but I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna have to roll with what I have, my equipment. Let's see what happens. And so I walk into the room, and I think we got there really early, so there weren't a lot of people. So then I kind of got a sense of like, okay, the size of the room, where the red carpet was gonna be, and so I was like, okay, like let me put myself there, and so as things got underway and more people started to fill the room, I also started to notice like, oh, like the MIC team and I were the only Black people here. Okay, true. Which I guess in my mind I'm like, I could have expected that, but I guess I don't really. You think about race, you think about these things, but you don't really think about them. At least for me, I think about it, but I don't think about it. I don't let it sort of drive my life. And so, but then I specifically in the pit, which was what you call the area where all the camera people are just lined up to try to get stars walking on the red carpet. In the pit, there were no women, with the exception of the hosts that are in front of the camera. But no, I don't remember seeing any like Black women or women in general behind the camera, whether they were photographers or whether they were videographers. So right off the bat, I was like, okay, no one's really standing here except that look like me, except me and Charisse, the other MIC intern. And so, and then I didn't know how this was gonna go down, so I'm just here with my camera. And so the red carpet happens, and so they announce whoever's coming, and then so we can know who it is, which I didn't know was the thing that happens. And so I had to figure out, okay, how am I gonna record this person's name? And so thankfully I was there with Charisse, so she recorded the names of the people who were walking, and then I just focused on just shooting and trying to get as many diverse shots as you could with somebody just standing in front of you. And then people started yelling at the people that were there to direct them, and I didn't realize that that's what would happen, because when you look at a red carpet scene, when you're watching, E-Talk or something, you just see the celebrities walk, you see the flashes, you don't really hear a lot of yelling, or if you do, you're not really thinking about what it's like for that photographer that's there doing that. You're just looking at what's happening to the star. And so to be at the other side of the camera and actually realize like, no, they're yelling so that they can get the angle and the shot. That's why they're yelling. And it's okay to yell, because if you don't yell and ask for what you want from them, they won't know what to do. And you won't get your shot at the end of the day. And the point of being in the pit is to get the shot and file whatever you need to file to whoever you're working for. And so I very, very quickly realized that if I needed to get the shot, I had to be just as loud as the, veteran like photojournalist that's right beside me that has the nice lens with the extra flash and all of that. So yeah. And so as soon as it got started, and I didn't, eventually I started to get a bit louder and louder. And then I realized like my voice stood out in the crowd. which was something I didn't really think about, but then I realized people were now looking at my camera because I was asking for the shots that I wanted, and directing whoever was in front of me to politely be like, hey, can you look at me and not this guy? And so that itself was like such a great experience. Like, I'm so happy I got a chance to do that. However uncomfortable I felt throughout that entire process, because trust and believe I was very uncomfortable throughout it. But in my mind, it was more important to do the job than my own sort of insecurity / fears or whatever anxiety was happening internally. So I tried to just fight through that and be like, no, get what you need to get. Forget your ego right now. let it fold, let it crumble. It's not about you. It's about the work you're doing. And yeah, that was a very interesting and very great experience that I got, and I'm very thankful for that.
That's a pretty powerful story. Why were you uncomfortable? I'm just curious.
I was uncomfortable just because anytime you feel like you're the only one in the space that looks like you, there's always the visibility. How visible you are is something you feel. You feel that you're othered. And I don't know if it's something that I kind of self-impose on myself or if it's just a habit. Like, I think in journalism, at least so far, and I did just graduate, but like, there's not a lot of women of color that I know of in the field. Like, most of my colleagues are not women of color. And so I always feel like I'm one of the only people of color in spaces like that. And I don't know, I guess I haven't gotten used to that, but I have in some weird way. But it's still always kind of like uncomfortable in a different kind of way. Like, I don't know how to really explain it, but you feel it. And I think when you are in a room with people who look like you, there's something that's less tense about that. So as a young graduate, one of the biggest benefits of doing a program like the Made in Canada internship program was just how hands-on you get to really be. I think it's one thing to talk about the film industry, to talk about funding and how you make a film and the processes involved when you do create the film, distribute the film, fund the film, all the things, all these pieces. It's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to be in the room with people who are doing all these things, talking about what they're trying to work out, right? And to just hear what that's like from like physically being in the room is, I think, something that you don't really get to have from just reading about it or like watching a YouTube video about somebody talking about it. Yeah, and also just like, I think specifically as a young woman of color trying to get into that space, physically being in the room and seeing what the room looks like, and what the conversations that are happening are like, and what that means for your own vision and your own place in that world is something that you can't really get from school. You could talk about it, but you won't really feel it until you're in the room. And so something like this, like an opportunity to be in the room, to hear it firsthand, is something that you can't really replicate unless you get there, right? So I think that's one of the biggest benefits. Yeah. So how the program was structured for me was that we had the expectation of prioritizing watching Canadian films first before anything else. And then the other part of not only just watching Canadian films, but also attending industry events. And prior to coming into this internship, I didn't realize that part of TIFF was not only just premiering films, but it was also a large part of it is also about the people behind the films figuring out the business of filmmaking as well. And these things, I think, happen behind closed doors because the public but the public sees the red carpet, the glitz and the glam, but I think part of the internship program also allows you to see both sides, and it also prioritizes your attendance in both sides of that coin. And so so one side of it was watching Canadian films, but also the other flip side was attending industry events, industry panels, whether they were mixers, whether they were dialogue series, or just connection events that TIFF had at the CBC Glen Gold studio. So it was a mix of all of that. And then the other part of the internship program was writing about that experience or sharing that experience in some way, whether it was through tweets, whether it was through written blog posts or Facebook photos or Instagram Snap stories, whatever way we could share what was happening while we were experiencing it. We were very much encouraged to do that, because it's not just about taking in what you're taking in by yourself, but also just sharing what's happening, and sharing your perspective of what that experience is like. So that's kind of how the program went. What I liked about the structure of that is that even if you don't know anything, you're kind of thrown into it, and it's overwhelming at first, like straight up overwhelming at first. It's a lot of information. You don't know who the people you're watching or who the people that are talking are. You don't. And then you later figure out, oh shit, like this person was really important. I should have had questions prepared. I should have had all these things. But then, so it's a lot of things coming at you at once. But I think what was helpful in digesting all these different steps was the check-ins that we had, sometimes before the event, sometimes after the event, to sort of figure out, oh yeah, when you went to this OMDC event, here are the people that were there. Here's why this event was there, and kind of processing why that event was important, so that you can understand why that event in the structure of TIFF makes sense and why it's necessary. And so processing a lot of that information through check-ins, face-to-face, whether or via telephone, I think was really helpful as somebody who's sort of thrown into festival season, right? And so I think for me that was the parts that I liked, was sort of like the check-ins, because it's a lot to take in if you're a noob to the industry, or if you're just trying to figure it out, right? Because that's the whole point of this internship, I think, is to kind of like, I mean, you could have, Marva and Orla talk to you about it, but like literally being like, okay, go figure it out, I think is another kind of beast, and you end up learning almost a little bit more by doing it, and risking being uncomfortable while you're in it. So the mentorship portion of the Made in Canada internship, I thought was really great. So how that played out basically was in the form of check-ins, and being very honest when we are sort of checking in every time, and being like, hey, I don't get what's happening. I don't know who I met yesterday. I don't know whose photos I took. What is this? And also and having the explanation behind why we're going to certain events was also helpful to try to digest that. I think also one of the most insightful things that came out of the mentorship is also getting Marva and Orla's insight of why it's important to kind of look at why certain events fit into the puzzle that is TIFF, or the puzzle that is the Canadian film industry, and what that actually even means, right? Because I think it's hard to get that off of a Google search. And so having having two mentors that are in the industry and have experience doing films, bringing in that insight was really great for me to sort of learn and understand from. Because I mean, I could Google, somebody could be like, oh yeah, the OMDC does this, or the South Africa partnerships with the Canadian film industry means that, but it's another thing to actually have somebody sort of that's in the field actually explain to you how that fits in that big puzzle that almost never makes sense, I think, from an outside perspective. Mm-hmm. So That's how I would say that.
Earlier you mentioned how exhausting the festival season was. Can you tell me what kept you going during the festival season?
I'm not sure. I honestly don't know. It's a miracle that I got through it, because I think what was one of the most challenging things throughout it was that for me personally, I was navigating an 8 to 5 job while doing it. So just the structure of having to do that, and then in the evening just trying to cram as much as you can. And then I don't drive, so like TTCing it back home and then repeating that over and over again was quite exhausting. And so I honestly feel like the only thing that keeps me going through, not only just what kept me through going through the TIFF season, but also in pursuing this stuff, is the feeling that I don't see myself doing anything else in terms of like helping produce stories. And because I'm very curious to just learn and absorb from as many people as I can, I just always sort of go on the hunch that this is going to help me understand so I could know what I'm doing next, or it's gonna lead to something, and it's an opportunity. If nothing else, let it be for something that I get to sort of experience and then learn from and decide whether or not I want to move this way versus that way. So, that's you know what? Prior to the Made in Canada internship program, I've watched a few Canadian films. They tended to be a lot of French Québécois films. And I feel like Quebec has a very strong film industry compared to maybe the rest of Canada, and so for me, and I love French films, I tried to watch, like I like, for example, I like to attend the Francophone Film Festival that happens in the city, which was canceled this year, but they do usually have it. And so my experience of like watching Canadian films came from just watching these types of films. But when it came to English-speaking Canadian films, I can't remember the last time I watched one, to be very honest. The Canadian films that I did watch were all from Quebec, and they were all in French.
Part of this program, what has it done to expand your knowledge of Canadian films and Canadian filmmaking?
So I think by being part of the Made in Canada film internship program, I got a better sense of the types of stories that are made here, and specifically when it comes to English Canadian films. I think one of the things I learned was like co-productions, and how that can play a role in terms of actually making films that are Canadian. I also the sense I got, and I could be wrong, is that I felt like when it came to Canadian films or English-speaking Canadian films, a lot of the stuff that was shown were documentary or shorts, and there weren't a lot of features, and then when they were French Canadian, and maybe that's how I interpreted my experience at TIFF, and maybe it's just the films that I ended up watching. And so that made me sort of feel like there is an opportunity for more stories to be told in English, and also even in French. But there's an opportunity for that, because I like to hope anyway that there's a need for that. How to even get there is another beast, but I think there's a lot of people that would have loved to watch more Canadian English speaking films that were good stories, like not just Canadian stories, but good Canadian stories.
Well, let's pick up on that point. What do you think defines a film as Canadian?
What do you mean? Like, what do I think, or what does TIFF think, or what does...
What do you think defines a film as Canadian?
That's a good question. It's a hard question.
Okay.
I think when I think about what makes a Canadian film, I want to say it's a film that reflects the reality of the Canadian experience. I think from what I learned with this internship is that that's not necessarily the case. If the money is Canadian and if the talent is Canadian and the story may not necessarily be Canadian, it's a Canadian film, which I understand, but I think for me, I'd like to believe that what makes a Canadian film is also that, but also stories that reflect the reality of what it's like to be Canadian. And there's such a richness, I think, about Canada, and a lot of richness that I think film, at least the film landscape from my understanding right now, doesn't really tap into too much of it. I almost feel like, and I could be wrong, but I almost feel like there's like a pattern of of certain films getting told or certain stories being told over and over again, and there's like different, I believe and I like to hope that there's different pockets in Canada or that reflect like the Canadian experience that are not necessarily the amplified Canadian experience that I think is still stories that are worth being told that are not necessarily being told. Like I also noticed that, and I appreciated that. I watched a lot of films that reflected the harsh realities of a lot of Indigenous and Aboriginal Canadians. And I also noticed that a lot of the directors behind these films were also First Nations or of Indigenous descent, which was super dope. But I also, that also kind of made me a bit, I don't know, worried a little bit. I don't know if that makes sense, but I just feel like even if you're going through oppression, even if you're going through a lot of difficulty, which I think a lot of First Nations and Aboriginal communities are, I think there's so many different kinds of stories as well that reflect the reality. Like it's not just like, you know, we don't get access to different resources by living in the reserve. But I know there's people that are still living in the reserves and still like falling in love. They're still building families. There's still these amazing stories. And so I think I would have loved to have a nuanced reflection of that, as opposed to documentary form of what it's like to live there. And that can also be said about different kinds of stories that are about minority groups or underrepresented groups or whatever. I'm not sure if that answered any of your question, but it's a tangent that happened in my brain and it just went off. One of the best things that came out of just being part of this program, and as being like a young person coming into this internship, we got to have a lot of creativity and leeway in terms of how we wanted to share what we were learning. And so that sort of creative freedom of like, hey, if you see something that's worth taking a photo of, take it. And you could take it however you want to take it. If you think this could make for a good tweet, like there's that sort of like, you could take this and make it what you want. So I think throughout the experience, like if I wanted to, I could have done like a live Periscope thing on Twitter where I sort of like basically live streamed like some events just on Twitter. I could have had that leeway if I wanted. I had that freedom. And so I think it's kind of cool to be able to have that freedom to kind of execute what the sharing looks like. It's like the task is to share. You could share however you want to. We recommend this and this, but do you? And so I appreciated that freedom because you don't necessarily get that with, not a lot of organizations will let you be as creative in terms of how you want to share or distribute the content that you're asked to share. Definitely recommend this internship program to any young aspiring filmmaker or anybody who's curious about the filmmaking industry, or even any journalist interested in like reporting about film, because it does allow you to, it does give you access, and it lets you be a fly on the wall in a lot of different places where you wouldn't necessarily have the access. And there's so much that can come from being in the room, and also being in the room at the right place at the right time. And so yeah, I think this program lets you get that sort of first-hand experience of the Canadian film industry, or at the very least it gives you a good taste of it, so that you can kind of go off and do your own research and figure out which part of the puzzle do you still need to put together. But it does give you sort of like a crash, I feel like it's like a crash course on, or at least an overview of what's the Canadian film industry like. At least for me, that's how I felt. But yeah, so I think anybody who wants to have that sort of crash course and also very hands-on way of absorbing what it's like, this is a great program to sort of take that from. Met a lot of the industry people behind the Canadian film industry, like some of the people that work at the OMDC or with the OMDC, or even people that have received funding from the OMDC, and meeting producers behind the films. I found that they felt human. And it's a bit of a weird answer, but I do think that I feel like as somebody who's trying to break into film, I do feel like the people who are able to have a film screened at TIFF and blah blah blah, I feel like there's this sort of like, maybe it's imagined, but this sort of like, they're not accessible. They're like these people that like made it. And so meeting them, it kind of made me realize that they were human, and that I got the vibe that it's possible to do what they're doing. And it was also really great to meet Cameron Bailey, and he was very friendly. I think in a lot of different times, because this was new, and and most of the times I didn't really know who I was meeting on whatever day. The journalist part of my brain wished I did more research every time, and I guess you can never have too much research, but I like to know of who I would meet before I meet them, so I know what to ask for. I know what to talk about if we're stuck in an elevator before we get to the event, like, you know. And so I think that part of my brain wish I was more prepared.